So, welcome to the interview series from Dharma Voices for Animals. I'm Jasmin from the German chapter, and this episode is focusing on the psychology of meat eating. And as I've announced in my last interview with Dr. Jeffrey Barstow, where we talked about the meat eating culture in Tibet from a historical point of view, I think that there is a kind of global pattern that seems to be time and culture independent when it comes to the issue of meat eating. And I think that if we want to bring about some change within our Dharma communities, we should look at this phenomenon and search for a solution and how to implement this. And that's why I've invited an expert on this topic. That's Dr. Melanie Joy. So Melanie, welcome and thank you for being here. That's really great that you take the time for the DVA project. And let me just introduce you to our audience, just for those who don't know you yet. So Melanie is a Harvard-educated psychologist. She's a celebrated speaker. She's the author of, meanwhile, 6 books. And she's the 8th recipient of the Ahimsa Award, previously given to the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela, for her work on global nonviolence. And her work has been featured in major media outlets around the world, including the BBC, ABC Australia, NPR, and the New York Times. And she's given talks and trainings in nearly 50 countries. Melanie is also the founding president of Beyond Carnism, which is an international organization that includes a center of effective vegan advocacy. Okay. So then let's start with the first question. I heard about the psychology of meat eating when I read your groundbreaking and award-winning book with the title Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and We Are Cows. That's already 10 years ago. I just realized when I prepared for the interview. And so, Melanie, can you please explain to us what is the psychology of meat eating? So what do you mean with the term carnism?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me on here and for that lovely introduction. So let me tell you a little bit about, to explain the psychology of eating animals. Let me just tell you a little bit about how I came to write my book in the first place. And this was really inspired by my own personal journey. And one of the reasons I'm grateful to be talking to you today is because my journey was informed right from the beginning by compassion. Compassion has always been a central driving force in my life. And also my journey has been driven by really a sense of justice, wanting to be fair in my actions and my choices. And when I was growing up back in the 70s, I was born in 1966, and I grew up with a dog who I loved like a family member, like many people do. And I also grew up as a person who had, as I said, compassion was very important to me, and I was a very sensitive child with a lot of empathy. I cared very much about my impact on others, other humans, and also other animals. And I also grew up eating meat, eggs, and dairy, eating animals. And for so much of my life, I never thought about how strange it was that I could pet my dog with one hand while, I ate a pork chop with the other. And a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as sensitive and sentient and intelligent as my dog. I just didn't connect those dots. What happened was that one day in 1989, I ate a contaminated hamburger, and I ended up in the hospital, really, really sick. And after that, I never wanted to eat meat again because I was just disgusted by it. So I became a vegetarian sort of by accident. And in the process of trying to learn about my new diet, what to eat, how to cook for myself, I encountered information about animal agriculture. And what I learned, shocked and horrified me. I could not believe the extent of the violence and the suffering of non-human animals who become meat, eggs, and dairy, become our food. As soon as I learned that, I quickly became a vegan after this. And I couldn't believe the impact on the environment, and then of course there's human health concerns. But what shocked me in some ways even more than this information was that everybody I talked to about what I was learning did not want to hear what I had to say. They would say things like, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal," or they'd call me a crazy vegan hippie propagandist. They had all sorts of reasons as to why eating animals was normal, natural, and necessary. It's tradition, it's the way things are, it's the way things have always been. There's a humane way to kill animals. We can be compassionate and thank the animals who become our food. It was just, I couldn't believe it. And so I then became really compelled to start trying to understand the psychology of eating animals. And my question was, how is it possible that compassionate people who care about animals and their impact on the environment and their impact on other humans and who are rational can just shut down psychologically and emotionally when it comes to this huge issue? And this is a big issue. In just one day, more animals are slaughtered than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. What we're talking about is nothing short of a global atrocity. And most people who really open their eyes and see what's actually happening behind closed doors are also shocked and horrified, and they don't want to participate in this. So my question became, how is it possible for caring people to participate in such a cruel industry without fully realizing what they're doing? And this was what led me to do the research that I did for my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating animals. And what I discovered in this process was that there is an invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. And I named this system Carnism. Carnism is essentially the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system. But the only reason that we might learn to eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do learn to follow a belief system. We do follow a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity, which is true for many, not all, but for many people in the world today, then it's a choice, and choices always stem from beliefs. But this belief that eating animals is the right thing to do, that certain animals are meant to be eaten is invisible, because carnism is invisible. So most people, even people who are really committed to living compassionately, nevertheless support an industry that is creating massive amounts of harm and damage on this planet. And carnism is a special kind of belief system. It's what we call a dominant system. That means it's so widespread. It's so widespread that its tenets, its teachings, its beliefs and practices are invisible. And they're woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And they are institutionalized. They're embraced and maintained by the major social institutions. So when somebody studies nutrition, for example, they're actually studying carnistic nutrition. When we look at history, we're looking at carnistic history. And of course, when we look at the world through the lens of carnism, we come up with all sorts of justifications as to why we should continue this process of slaughtering and consuming animals. And when we're born into a system that's institutionalized, we inevitably internalize that system. That means we learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. And what carnism does is it distorts our perceptions and disconnects us from our natural empathy for animals so that we act against our compassion and our sense of justice without realizing what we're doing. Because most people would be deeply opposed to eating animals if they were really fully connected with the process, with what is actually happening.
Yeah.
And Carnism, like other isms, Carnism is structured like other systems of oppression, other isms like patriarchy and racism, classism, and so on. It runs counter to core human values. And so it needs to use a set of psychological defense mechanisms so that we're not fully present to our choices. We don't even realize that we're making choices when we're eating animals. So it's very, very important for people to become aware. Awareness is really the key. Awareness is the key to many forms of transformation. Yeah. Certainly is the key to transforming violent systems. With awareness, we can look at the world through our own eyes. We can make choices that reflect what we authentically think and feel, rather than what we've been conditioned to think and feel.
You also speak about a matrix. I think this is a very good way to describe it. It's like as the whole humanity would be plugged in a matrix, right?
Yeah, it's one analogy that I use, definitely. It's my later work is on the psychology of oppression more broadly. And what I looked at was the sort of the meta system of oppression, like this, I would say the meta mentality of oppression for this conversation. All oppression and abuse reflects the same mentality. The same mentality or psychology is at the core of all forms of oppression and abuse, regardless as to whether we're carrying that out against human or non-human animals, as individuals or as part of a system or a social group. We always are engaging in the same mentality. And that allows us, what this mentality does is it causes us to disconnect from our natural empathy from these other individuals, and therefore to treat them in ways that we would not otherwise. And we come up with all sorts of, Carnism uses a whole elaborate, set of justifications and defense mechanisms. The entire system is organized around these psychological defense mechanisms that most people have no idea are driving their choices. And most people have no idea that their preferences for what or who they eat have been shaped for them. So when we become aware of Carnism, we can step outside of the carnistic box and see much more clearly. So I'll give you an example of some carnistic defenses that might help make this clearer for listeners or viewers. So one defense mechanism is, de-individualization. We learn to think of farmed animals as lacking any individuality or personality of their own. So we learn to think, for example, that a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. We also learn to see farmed animals or think of farmed animals as objects. So when we look at the chicken on our plate, we refer to that as something rather than someone. These are distancing mechanisms. Or we learn to justify eating animals. And the way we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of meat, eggs, and dairy are the facts of meat, eggs, and dairy. There's a whole set of justifications, but they all fall under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And of course, these same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history, from male dominance to heterosexual supremacy. One way you can see the kind of mental gymnastics of Carnism at work is when you think about this idea of, what you call in Germany, Biofleisch, or eggs or dairy, humane meat, eggs or dairy, right? This idea, I call this compassionate Carnism. This idea that somehow slaughtering somebody to eat them is compassionate. And one way to understand this is to just, think about how most of us would consider it cruel to slaughter a happy, healthy golden retriever simply because people like the way her legs taste. And yet, when the exact same thing is done to individuals of other species, we're expected to call that humane. I mean, in some ways, it's even worse when an animal wants to continue living their life and has created connections and friendships. And carnism also, like other oppressive systems, it also conditions us to feel resistant to or defensive against any information that would get us out of the carnistic box. So you can see this when it comes to vegans, right? Often, as soon as somebody who's not vegan, right? As soon as that person meets a vegan, they think, whoa, okay, watch out. There's just this automatic sense of defensiveness.
They run away.
They might run away. I mean, that's right. And not everybody is like this, but it is quite a common phenomenon. And that is one of the ways that systems such as carnism maintain themselves or keep themselves alive. The system is structured so that psychologically we support what it wants us to support, and we resist anything that challenges it. So, when a vegan, for example, questions the bias of carnistic nutrition, we automatically believe the vegan is biased, right? So there's all sorts
vegan
of
is
ways.
Wrong. The vegan is wrong.
The vegan is automatically wrong.
Yeah.
So, but in particular, not just wrong, but biased, because we don't recognize the invisible bias of the system. And so the good news about this is that, it's when we recognize that we're conditioned by this system to support it, it gives us the opportunity to really rethink how we participate in the system. And rather than thinking, I'm a bad person because I'm supporting the system, we can feel compassion for ourselves, which we all need to do anyway, and say, I'm a person who was born into a system that conditioned me to think and feel and act in certain ways. And now I'm learning how to disengage and disentangle myself from that system so that I can change the way that I participate in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that you also said that if we eat animal products, we have to numb our feelings somehow in order to be able to engage in such a behavior. And I think that if we numb our feelings, it's not really mindful. And then we start to do negative things like killing animals, torture them, and all the things that come up with that. Yeah.
Well, if we allow ourselves to be fully present to, emotionally present to the reality of what is happening when we're putting dead animals into our mouths, most of us become very uncomfortable with that. And, my research and other research has shown that people go through all sorts of psychological justifications and psychological gymnastics, essentially, in order to mitigate or manage the discomfort that we might otherwise feel. It's psychologically, sometimes we have to numb ourselves. There are people who don't have a choice about what they eat. Some people are economically unable to make their food choices freely. They're geographically unable to make their food choices freely. But for those of us for whom, this is not a choice anymore, or not a given, but a choice, our experience is different. And the way to think about this is to think about how, when a behavior is a necessity, then we have to engage in it, because otherwise, it's almost like a matter of self-defense. But once a behavior is no longer a necessity for survival, it takes on an ethical dimension it didn't have in the same way before. And this is one reason that I think a lot more people are becoming uncomfortable with the idea of eating animals, because we now are free to reflect ethically on our choices.
So we are in a very good position that we can think about it. So we have the choice. So we don't have to eat animal products if we don't want to. So so that's very good, but it's also challenging. And but society is changing right now.
Society is changing, and it's changing very quickly. I've been all over the world, to over 50 countries now, 6 continents, talking about this issue. And with people in positions of leadership in the vegan movement, and also with people who are influencers who are not vegan, like journalists who work for major publications, for example, restaurant owners. And everywhere around the world, I've seen the same thing, which is that awareness of animal agriculture and the violence inherent in animal agriculture grows, so is a concern for the well-being of non-human animals. And as the availability of plant-based products increases and awareness of the health benefits of eating a plant-based diet and the dangers of eating a carnistic diet grows, people are increasingly supporting a shift toward a vegan or a plant-based diet. We also still have a long way to go because there is a strong vested interest in maintaining the carnistic norm or the carnistic status quo among some companies, for example. Medical, unfortunately, in some countries, in many countries, the medical establishment has not caught up with this growing awareness and growing consciousness. So even there's a lot of great information now and support, literature demonstrating the benefits of the health benefits of eating a plant-based diet and the dangers of eating a carnistic diet. Medical institutions are slow to change. So thankfully, we have some great groups like here in Germany and in Europe is the Physicians Association for Nutrition, or PAN International. They're bringing this information out and forward. But there are also a lot of people still who they hear this information, they want to change, and then their doctor tells them they have to go back to eating animals. And so it's really important that we think critically and we recognize that medicine is carnistic medicine. Nutrition is still carnistic nutrition because it's steeped with this bias.
Yeah, that's true. So don't tell your doctor that you're vegan.
Well, or maybe it's important to tell your doctor that you're vegan. And if your doctor responds in a way that's not supportive, don't be surprised and automatically assume that it's not healthy to be vegan. And I always recommend that people, try to be as vegan as possible. That's really the most important thing we can do. You ask yourself at each meal, how vegan can I make this meal? Rather than saying I have to be vegan, either I'm vegan and I'm part of the solution, or I'm not vegan and I'm part of the problem. You can be, what I call a vegan ally who is a supporter of veganism and vegans. Use your influence to raise awareness and to help bring about change and help transform carnism.
Yeah, that's true. So I just simply changed my doctor. I have a new one, and he's vegan himself and also a vegan activist. So that's perfect. So, but Melanie, what I also wanted to ask you, there's also another term, it's speciesism, where I think that, this is really quite well known, this term among activists, but I think that many Dharma practitioners don't know. So can you just say in short words what's speciesism and what's the difference between speciesism and carnism? Because it's quite similar.
Sure. All of these systems of oppression, these isms, speciesism, carnism, sexism, classism, racism, genderism, and so on, they all stem from the same core belief. And this is the belief in a hierarchy of moral worth. In other words, it's the belief that certain individuals or groups are more worthy of being treated with compassion, with respect than others. The difference is simply, which group we're talking about. So speciesism is the belief in the hierarchy of moral worth of animals, essentially. It's the ideology or belief system that conditions us to place all animals on a hierarchy with humans at the top. And humans, of course, are so far at the top that we don't even call ourselves animals. Like we think that we're fundamentally somehow, not even part of the same category. Carnism is a sub-ideology of speciesism. Just like anti-Semitism, for example, is a sub-ideology of racism. They're structured exactly the same way, but carnism is focused specifically on farmed animals or animals we've learned to classify as edible.
Okay. Yeah, that's. I just wanted to bring this up because I think that when we look at the Dharma at Buddhism, we can see that that Buddhist ethics is somehow anti-speciesistic, if we can say, because in the Dharma we are taught that we should not discriminate. So we should not think that we stand above animals, but we should cultivate to extend our love and compassion to all sentient beings, including animals. And for example, we think that all beings have once been our former mothers. So you know that we believe in rebirth in Buddhism. And I can see that most of the Dharma practitioners, when they start listening to Dharma talks, they stop killing flies or killing spiders. So, or if they hunt, they stop hunting or fishing. So that's what they understand. So, and I think that also many lamas are very, very good role models here. And they talk about these kinds of ethics. But at the same time, we definitely have a problem with carnism because most of the Dharma practitioners eat animal products. And so therefore, that's the reason why I really wanted to talk about this, this topic with you about carnism, because obviously talking about Buddhist ethics within Dharma talks is good, but it seems that it's not enough. So because otherwise the Dharma practitioners would be vegan, but they aren't in most cases. And that's why I really would like to focus on the psychology. That's why I think it could be helpful to learn about this and to look at this and to implement this in Dharma talks. I think that this could be very, very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. And people, you know, this is sort of testament to carnism. Most veterinarians eat and wear animals, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And most environmentalists eat and wear animals, right? And we can see how this is what carnism does. I mean, this is the psychology of carnism. It creates these so-called blind spots for us. Where we make exception to what we would normally consider unacceptable. So, and this is why it's so important to shine the light of awareness on carnism, because then it allows people to step outside of this mentality and, you know, reconnect with their own authentic experience and make decisions that are more in alignment with what they believe and value.
Yeah. And I think this is also kind of our spiritual path. Yeah. So we don't want to have these blind spots where we create suffering to other sentient beings, to the world, to ourselves. That's what we want to stop. So, and therefore I think it's also part of a spiritual development to inform ourselves about carnism and think about it and reflect on this. So yeah, so Melanie, if people are now interested, hopefully, so where can they learn more about carnism?
Sure, they can go to our website, carnism.org.
Yeah, and you've got so many very good videos and also your books, and you also offer trainings. So yeah,
Thank you.
Wonderful. Melanie, thank you very much for this interview. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I would also announce that we will make a second interview where we go from the flip side, so to speak, and we will try to practice compassion for vegans by just looking how it feels like to be a vegan within a meat-eating society.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.